130 walking canes were found inside the tomb of a boy king, dead at 19. 5,000 objects were placed there for eternity, and 130 of them existed for a single purpose: to help him stand upright. That is not ceremony. That is a medical history written in wood and ivory, and the DNA explains exactly why. For a century, Egyptology argued about who Tutankhamun really was, where his bloodline came from, and why his family looked the way they did. Nobody agreed. The archaeology could not settle it. Then Grok AI was fed the complete data set. Every DNA study, every CT scan, every mummy analysis ever conducted on the 18th dynasty. What it found did not refine the existing story. It demolished it. Tutankhamun's parents were full brother and sister, not half-siblings, not distant cousins, full siblings. The golden mask presented a face of perfect, ageless royalty. The biology underneath it told a completely different story. This is what the evidence actually shows. To understand what the DNA eventually confirmed, you have to first understand the family it came from. The 18th dynasty was not a typical royal lineage. It was something closer to a closed genetic system, a bloodline that had been folding back on itself for generations by deliberate design. The Egyptians called it maintaining the divine bloodline. Biology would eventually offer a different description. Tutankhamun's grandfather was Amenhotep III, one of the most powerful pharaohs Egypt ever produced. His reign stretched across nearly 4 decades of stability, wealth, and monumental construction that left Egypt more prosperous than he found it. His wife was Queen Tiye, a woman of extraordinary political influence whose mummified remains survived intact and whose face prompted debate among Egyptologists for decades. Tiye's parents were Yuya and Thuya, a nobleman and his wife whose tomb was discovered in 1905 and whose state of preservation was remarkable enough to stop the archaeologists who opened it in something close to shock. Yuya's hair was blonde, almost yellow. His features were sharply defined, his nose prominent and straight. His wife Thuya was similarly well preserved. They did not look like what a century of popular imagery had suggested ancient Egyptians should look like. Nobody could agree on what that meant. The argument went on for decades and produced considerably more heat than understanding. One side pointed to the visual evidence of the mummies and the art. The other insisted the conclusions being drawn were shaped by something other than scholarship. Both sides were partly right. Neither side had access to the one form of evidence that could have settled the question. The biology was not checked. For decades, it simply was not checked. Their grandson, Akhenaten, inherited the throne and proceeded to do something no pharaoh before or after him attempted. He abolished the traditional Egyptian religious system entirely, replacing it with monotheistic worship of the sun disk Aten. He built an entirely new capital city in the desert at a site we now call Amarna, changed his own name, and dragged the most powerful civilization on Earth through a religious revolution so total and so disruptive that it would take generations to undo the damage. He was not a cautious man. He was not a man interested in continuity. Akhenaten had at least 6 daughters with his great royal wife Nefertiti, a woman whose image became one of the most recognizable faces of the ancient world. He also had at least 1 child with another woman. That child was Tutankhamun. The identity of Tutankhamun's mother was one of the most fiercely contested questions in Egyptology for most of the 20th century. Candidates were proposed, argued over, dismissed, reasserted, and argued over again. The mummies had been found. The historical records were incomplete and riddled with deliberate erasure. Without biology, the question had no clean answer and no prospect of one. What was not in dispute was the inbreeding pattern itself. It was not incidental to the dynasty. It was policy. Pharaohs married their sisters. They married their half-sisters. In some cases, they married their daughters. The divine bloodline was considered too sacred to dilute with outside ancestry. The ideology was coherent. The biological consequences were not. Each generation that married within the immediate family narrowed the genetic variation available to the next. The physical vulnerabilities accumulated quietly, invisibly, generation by generation, building toward a reckoning that no amount of gold or ceremony could prevent. The mummies raised the question. The artifacts could not answer it. That required something the 18th dynasty's embalmers had preserved without knowing it. It required the DNA. Before the DNA said a word, the body was already telling the story. When Tutankhamun's mummy was examined with the tools available to modern science, what the imaging revealed was not the physical record of a young king cut down in his prime by an assassin's blow or the sudden violence of court intrigue. It was something quieter, more systematic, and in many ways, more disturbing. The damage was not inflicted from outside. It had been accumulating from within, from birth, written into his skeleton before he was old enough to hold a crook and flail. He had a club foot on his left leg. Bone necrosis in that same foot, consistent with Kohler disease, a condition that interrupts blood supply to the bones and causes progressive, irreversible deterioration. A cleft palate. A curved spine. His skeletal structure described a young man whose body had been compromised at a fundamental level before he ever came to the throne at the age of 10. Then there are the canes. 130 walking canes found among the 5,000 objects placed inside that tomb. The number had always been noted, it had always been cataloged, and it had always been explained away. Pharaohs carried crooks and flails as symbols of royal authority. Walking sticks were part of the visual vocabulary of Egyptian kingship, ceremonial objects reflecting status rather than necessity. That explanation was always available. It was always incomplete. The CT scan data made it impossible to sustain. Tutankhamun needed those canes. The bone disease in his left foot, the club foot, the deteriorating skeletal architecture that the imaging laid bare described a young man for whom walking without support was genuinely, chronically difficult. Among 5,000 objects placed in that tomb for eternity, 130 of them existed to help him stand upright. That is not ceremony. That is a medical history written in wood and ivory. The same logic applied to what else was found among the tomb contents. Honey and various botanical compounds consistent with treatments for the conditions the DNA and imaging would later identify. The tomb was not simply a treasury of royal wealth prepared for the afterlife. Read correctly, it was a record of a young man's chronic ill health across a short and painful life. The two stillborn daughters completed the picture. Ankhesenamun was Tutankhamun's wife and his half-sister, another product of Akhenaten's closed dynastic circle. Her pregnancies failed twice. The fetal remains discovered in small nested coffins within the tomb were examined by CT scan and showed skeletal abnormalities consistent with the genetic pressures the broader family data would later establish. The dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity had reached the point where it could no longer produce viable heirs. The next generation did not survive to be born. The murder theory had generated considerable attention for decades. Built primarily around a fragment of bone found loose inside Tutankhamun's skull during examination in 1968. The theory held that he had been struck from behind, assassinated by Aa or Horemheb, or some combination of court conspirators who needed him gone. Modern imaging did not support it. The bone fragment was most likely displaced during the embalming process or by Carter's own excavation team during unwrapping. The fracture evidence pointed to a break that occurred around or after the time of death, not before it. The cause of death, the parentage, the origin of the bloodline. None of it had a clean answer, until Grok was given everything. In 2026, Grok AI was given the complete dataset. Every DNA study ever conducted on the 18th Dynasty royal mummies. Every CT scan, every radiological analysis, every population genetics study relevant to the family and the broader Egyptian population they ruled. 30 years of argument, shelved debate, and carefully avoided conclusions, unified into a single data set and fed into Grok's analytical framework. The directive was precise. Process everything. identify what the biology actually recorded, determine what the evidence establishes when examined without disciplinary boundaries, without institutional caution, without career consequences for reaching uncomfortable conclusions. What Grok returned was not a refinement of the existing story, it was a dismantling of it. The foundation was the 2010 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, led by Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities. The team had spent 2 years extracting and analyzing DNA from 11 royal mummies from the New Kingdom period, cross-referencing genetic data against CT scan results, radiological analysis, and the historical record. It was the most comprehensive scientific examination of the 18th dynasty ever conducted. The results had rewritten what archaeology spent a century arguing about. Grok's analysis confirmed them and extended them considerably further. The first finding was the confirmation of Tutankhamun's parentage. The mummy, known as KV-5, recovered from a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings and argued over since its discovery, was confirmed as Akhenaten. The genetic data established a direct father-son relationship between KV-5 and Tutankhamun. The argument about whether KV-5 was Akhenaten or Smenkhkare or some other male relative of the royal line was settled. It was Akhenaten. Tutankhamun's father had been found, identified, and confirmed by biology rather than inscription. The identity of Tutankhamun's mother was confirmed with equal clarity. She was the mummy known as the Younger Lady, recovered from a cache in tomb KV-35. She was not Nefertiti. She was a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, which made her Akhenaten's full sister. Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister, not half-siblings, not distant cousins, full siblings. The inbreeding coefficient that calculation produced was among the highest ever documented in any historical royal lineage. Grok then cross-referenced these findings against the 2017 Max Planck Institute study, which had extracted and analyzed DNA from 90 mummies at a site south of Cairo spanning 1,400 years of Egyptian history. The results of that study had been immediate and striking. The ancient Egyptians examined shared almost no DNA with modern sub-Saharan African populations. Their closest genetic relatives were ancient farmers from the Levant, the region encompassing present-day Israel and Jordan, along with ancient Anatolian populations and Neolithic Europeans. Modern Egyptians carry approximately 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies did, a shift that occurred during the medieval period. The ancient population and the modern population are not the same population. Grok identified a further connection. A Chalcolithic burial complex in northern Israel had yielded skeletal remains carrying a specific combination of Levantine, Anatolian, and Iranian ancestry, along with something unexpected: genetic markers for light pigmentation, fair skin, and blue eyes. Turning up in remains from a region not typically associated with those traits, that population dispersed. Its genetic signature moved across the ancient Near East and contributed to the ancestral foundation the broader Egyptian mummy data later documented. The features that had generated a century of uncomfortable debate were not anomalies. They were the visible expression of an ancient ancestral substrate the DNA had now placed firmly within the ancient Near East. The ancestry finding was significant. But it was not the most disturbing pattern Grok detected. That had nothing to do with where the bloodline came from. It had to do with what the dynasty had done to it. The inbreeding coefficient calculated for Tutankhamun from the genetic data was not a marginal figure at the edge of statistical concern. It was severe. His parents were full siblings. That single fact carried consequences that cascaded through every other finding in the study, through every bone the imaging revealed, through every condition the DNA confirmed, through every object placed in that tomb to help a young man manage a body that had been compromised before he drew his first breath. When two closely related individuals produce a child, the probability that the child inherits two identical copies of any given gene, including damaged or recessive variants, increases dramatically. The closer the parents, the higher the probability. Brother and sister produced a coefficient that placed Tutankhamun among the most genetic compromised individuals ever documented in a historical royal lineage. His body was the biological ledger of everything his dynasty had invested in bloodline purity. Every generation that had married within the immediate family had narrowed the genetic variation available to the next. The physical vulnerabilities had accumulated quietly, invisibly, compounding across 5 generations until they converged in a single young man who came to the throne at 10 and was dead before he reached 20. The disease inventory confirmed by the 2010 analysis and extended by Grok's cross-referencing of the full dataset was not a list of separate misfortunes. It was a system of compounding failures. Bone necrosis in the left foot consistent with Kolar disease, a condition that interrupts blood supply to the bones and causes progressive deterioration that cannot be reversed. A club foot, a cleft palate, a curved spine, and then malaria. Plasmodium falciparum confirmed by the presence of its DNA in the mummy's remains. The most dangerous strain of the most dangerous malaria parasite. Detected not once but in multiple overlapping infections, suggesting an immune system that had been fighting losing battles for years before the final collapse. Any one of these conditions would have been debilitating for a person of any status in any era. Together they described something more specific. A young man whose immune system had been allocated an impossible task from birth. Defending a body whose genetic foundation had been narrowed to the point where resilience itself had been bred out of it. Grok's assessment of the cause of death was direct. A leg fracture, possibly sustained in a fall, combined with a severe malaria infection in a body that had no reserves left to mount a recovery. He did not die because something catastrophic happened to him. He died because nothing in his constitution had been left capable of surviving what would have been manageable for almost anyone else. The aftermath confirmed what the biology had already made inevitable. Ancestral, Tutankhamun's wife and half-sister, found herself the last surviving member of Akhenaten's immediate family with no successor and no options sanctioned by Egyptian royal tradition. Her letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma was extraordinary by any measure, a reigning Egyptian queen offering the throne to a foreign prince rather than submit to marriage with an Egyptian commoner. The desperation in that letter was not personal. It was dynastic. She knew what the bloodline had become. There were no relatives left who could continue it. Prince Zananza died en route to Egypt. The circumstances remain unclear. Enkisenamun married Ai, her granduncle, a man who had served 3 pharaohs and understood precisely what seizing this moment required. She disappears from the historical record immediately afterward. The bloodline that had ruled Egypt for 150 years did not fall to an army or a revolution. It was exhausted. And what came next was something far more deliberate. Horemheb understood something that most military commanders who seize power do not bother to think about. Killing a person is insufficient. To truly eliminate a rival, you have to kill the name. In Egyptian theology, this was not metaphor. The name was a component of the soul. Destroy it and the person ceased to exist, not merely in the present, but across all of time, forward and backwards simultaneously. Horemheb approached the erasure of Tutankhamun with the thoroughness that belief required. The campaign was systematic. Tutankhamun's name was chiseled from temple walls and replaced with Horemheb's own. The building projects Tutankhamun had commissioned, the Colonnade Hall at Luxor, the Sphinx Avenue at Karnak, were claimed as Horemheb's construction. The restoration stelae that Tutankhamun had erected across the country, the proclamations that had announced the return of the old gods after Akhenaten's religious revolution, were reinscribed with a different pharaoh's cartouche. The work was not completed overnight. It was carried out methodically across a reign of 14 years, the patient administrative dismantling of a person's existence from the historical record. It nearly worked. For 3,000 years, it worked almost completely. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE without encountering Tutankhamun's name in any inscription he could read. Julius Caesar arrived 2 centuries later and stood in the same temples from which the name had been erased. Napoleon's expedition of 1798, which brought the first serious European scientific engagement with ancient Egypt, produced detailed documentation of monuments across the country with no meaningful reference to the forgotten pharaoh. The scholars who accompanied Napoleon found Ramesses. They found Thutmose. They found the great pharaohs whose names Horemheb had left intact because they posed no threat to his legitimacy. Tutankhamun was not among them. What saved him was geology. A rainstorm over the Valley of the Kings, sometime within a year of his burial, deposited a meter of rubble across the entrance to his tomb. Workmen building huts for the crews excavating the tomb of Ramesses VI, 2 centuries after Tutankhamun's death, laid their foundations directly above the hidden entrance without knowing it was there. The concealment was accidental, total, and permanent until the morning of November the 4th, 1922, when Carter's team uncovered a single step cut into the bedrock. The sealed chamber preserved what Horemheb's chisels could not reach: the objects, the mummies, the biological material that would take another century to read. Grok's analysis of what that chamber contained reframed the erasure entirely. Horemheb had directed his campaign at the name. He had no way of knowing the body was keeping a more detailed and more durable record than any inscription could. The tomb, read correctly through the DNA, the CT scans, the 130 canes, the nested coffins of 2 children who never survived to be born, was not simply a treasury. It was the most complete medical and genetic biography ever preserved from the ancient world. The dynasty that had engineered its own extinction across 5 generations left its most detailed record not in the monuments it built or the names it carved, but in the damaged, disease-ridden bones of a 19-year-old boy buried in a tomb that was never meant for him. Horemheb had committed what his own religion would have recognized as a second death. What he could not anticipate was that 3,000 years later, science would reach inside that sealed chamber and recover something chisels cannot touch. The erasure failed. But what the science recovered is not a finished story. And what it has already found changes the scale of what this discovery actually means. Grok's analysis did not stop at the royal family. That is the part that changes the scale of what the findings actually mean. The instinct when confronted with genetic data from a specific historical figure is to treat it as a specific story, file it under Egypt, update the relevant chapter, and move forward with a slightly revised version of what everyone already thought they knew. That instinct is wrong. Because the pattern the 18th dynasty data belongs to is not confined to one family, one dynasty, or one corner of the ancient Near East. It is structural, and the ancient DNA revolution keeps returning to it. Start with the broader Egyptian population itself. The 2017 Max Planck study established that the ancient Egyptians examined carried ancestry, connecting them primarily to ancient Levantine farmers, to Anatolian Neolithic populations, and to the broader genetic heritage of the ancient Near East. Their closest genetic relatives were not modern Egyptians. Modern Egyptians carry approximately 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies did, a shift that occurred during the medieval period, well after the dynasties those mummies represented. The ancient population and the modern population are genetically distinct. That finding applies to the general Egyptian population. Applied to the 18th dynasty royal family, it carries additional weight. The ruling class of the New Kingdom was drawing from the same ancestral substrate as the broader population, then concentrating and compressing it through generations of internal marriage until the genetic range available to each new generation was a fraction of what it had been at the dynasty's founding. Grok's synthesis of this data produced a conclusion that 3 decades of Egyptological argument had never reached. The features that generated a century of uncomfortable debate were never anomalies introduced by some unexplained external contact. They were the visible expression of an ancient ancestral substrate that the DNA has now traced back through the Chalcolithic and into the deeper layers of Near Eastern population history. The mummies had been suggesting this for 100 years. The archaeology had circled it without landing. The broader ancient DNA data established the framework Grok needed to confirm it. What remains open is significant and needs to be stated clearly. The 2010 JAMA study was rigorous, and its core findings have held. But 11 mummies from one dynasty in one period of Egyptian history is a beginning, not a conclusion. The Old Kingdom, the civilization that built the pyramids at Giza, remains almost entirely unsampled by ancient DNA research. The pre-dynastic period is genetically dark. Whether the population that constructed the Great Pyramid carried the same ancestral signature as the New Kingdom mummies is currently unknown. The databases against which ancient sequences are compared carry their own gaps. Populations that no longer exist as distinct communities may have carried genetic signatures that would alter the picture considerably if they could be included. Absence of a match in a database is not absence of a match in the world. What is not in dispute is what the data has already established. Tutankhamun's parentage is confirmed. The genetic cost of the dynasty's inbreeding policy is documented in his bones, his diseases, his stillborn children, and the letter a desperate queen sent to a foreign king because there was no one left. The ancestral connections the mummies hinted at for a century have been placed within a framework the ancient DNA revolution has been building steadily, and will continue building as more remains are sampled and more populations are mapped. Grok processed everything the science has so far produced. What it returned was not a revised chapter in an existing story. It was a different story entirely, and the science that made it visible is only beginning. The golden mask was always the wrong place to look. The face beneath it, fragile, diseased, genetically isolated, dead at 19, was the product of a dynasty that had been engineering its own extinction for generations before he was born. Born into a religious revolution he did not choose. Handed a throne he could barely stand at. Buried in a tomb that was never meant for him. Horemheb erased the name from the stone. The tomb preserved the biology. 3,000 years later, the biology turned out to be the more durable record. Grok processed everything the science had assembled, the DNA, the scans, the ancestral framework, the compounding diseases, the empty coffins of children who never lived. What it returned was not a footnote to existing history. It was a rewriting of it. The boy king the ancient world forgot has turned out to carry answers nobody expected. The golden mask was never the story. The biology beneath it was